Welcome to the 6th installment of History.Swiftly virtual field trips for the 2020-2021 school year. And we are at Gettysburg, the pivotal battle of the Civil War, a three-day battle that happened on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863. And we're going to be touring the battlefield, going through what happened on each of those 3 days. So, obviously, we'll start with day one, which is sort of where I am in that area right now, and we'll work our way through the results of the war. So here's a quick trivia question. What is the significance of my hat? So I'm sort of in the area where the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863 would have happened. Gettysburg, there's always been the theory that Gettysburg was fought over shoes, that the Confederate Army was moving into Gettysburg looking for a warehouse full of shoes that they had heard rumored in Gettysburg. That's probably most definitely not correct. There is absolutely no history of that being the case. The reason why it was probably Gettysburg is that Robert E. Lee was moving his army well into the north, trying to inflict carnage and bloodshed in the north, taking advantage of the successes that he had had in a number of battles just prior to Gettysburg. If you look back, going back into 1862, scoring victories at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Antietam was a bit of a draw, but then you had Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and looking to add to that success, moving into Gettysburg. In addition, that there was hope that there were Northerners that were looking to pursue peace, Copperheads, Democrats, that were looking to pursue peace rather than continue to have this war fought, especially as the North was not doing as well in the Civil War. So they met at Gettysburg. It's a small town of about 2,400 people. There were, the town itself, and we'll go into the town, sits at a crossroads of about 10 different roads coming in and out of Gettysburg. The North came in from the South that day. The South came in from the North that day. And the first day of skirmishes, and that's exactly what they were, compared to day 2 and day 3, were relatively light. Not that there weren't casualties, there certainly were. But by the end of day 1, the North had taken a defensive position, holding 2 high grounds, which I know are a little bit hard to see here. I'll see if I can zoom in, but you've got Culp's Hill off in the distance here, and then as I pan a little bit to the right, you'll notice a couple of other larger hills, and that is going to be Big Round Top and Little Round Top, and obviously we're going to get much closer to them as the day progresses. But the North is going to take kind of an inverted, upside down fish hook position in and around the town of Gettysburg and hold a defensive position after day 1. So in 1938, this was dedicated by Franklin Roosevelt as a reminder to the reconciliation between the blue and the gray. The idea for a monument here at Gettysburg began actually in 1913 on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, but it would be 1938, the 75th anniversary, that Franklin Roosevelt dedicated this memorial, and there was a crowd of about 200,000 people that were actually here in 1938 who listened to Franklin Roosevelt's keynote address. As you take a look at it, the base of it is actually made out of Maine granite, so obviously northern state, and the shaft, the eternal flame at the top, which is a little bit hard to see with the sunlight here, but I promise you there is a flame up there, is made out of Alabama limestone. And interestingly, in 1938, when Franklin Roosevelt was here with a crowd of 200,000, there were about 1,800 Civil War vets that actually were in attendance as well. And as you can imagine, this is the 75th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. Many of them were well into their 90s at that point. So again, this is sort of where the early skirmishes of the Battle of Gettysburg began. We are not far from Oak Ridge, and it would have been in this area that on day 1, July 1st, 1863, that Union General James Robinson gave Colonel Charles Tilden and the 16th Volunteer Regiment out of Maine an order to take and hold this position right where I'm standing now, sort of right where this parking lot is right here. realizing that that they were either going to be killed or captured, and did not want their regimental flag, and the flag was very significant to each regiment, to fall into the hands of the Confederacy, he plunged his sword into the ground, broke it off the hilt, and he and his men shredded the flag into small pieces to give each of the soldiers prior to being captured. In the end, 164 men from the 16th Maine were captured and sent to Confederate prisons, some going to Andersonville prison down in Georgia, which was notoriously the worst prison in the Civil War. They took their little piece of the flag with them, and years later, pieces of that flag returned to Gettysburg, this most hallowed ground. So again, here we are on Oak Ridge, the Day 1 area, and as I walk towards the memorial here, this one's sort of interesting. It's a memorial to the 90th Pennsylvania, and according to oral tradition, during the battle on July 1st, an artillery shell smashed a large oak tree, causing the tree to explode with limbs and branches falling to the ground. A soldier from the 90th Pennsylvania spotted a nest with a baby robin in it that had fallen to the ground, and in the heat of the battle, he picked it up, put it back into the shattered tree, and this sculpture here, which is a little bit hard to see because of the sun, but this sculpture here sort of represents that regeneration of life and the dawn of a new era of tranquility and kindness. And if you take a look at it, it's obviously made to look like a tree, and I'll try to zoom in here. You can see up top in this big old replication of an oak tree, you see a bird and a robin and a nest, and sort of a cannonball that's lodged in there as well. This is the memorial for the 11th Pennsylvania and their dog, their mascot Sally, who after the battle stayed here in these fields, sort of guarding the troops and the dead who were lost on July 1st, the first day. And they were eventually buried on July 5th, and the dog would not leave their side. The dog Sally would not leave their side. So when they created the monument for the 11th Pennsylvania, they obviously needed to keep Sally in it as well. So sadly, Sally would die 10 months later at the Battle of the Wilderness, but she is memorialized in this statue here. As I'm walking around the battlefield here on this beautiful but chilly Saturday morning in April, I have to say, of all of the virtual field trips that we've done so far, I think I miss students most on this one. This has always been a favorite of mine. It's a great trip. Now there will be a few things that I think I'll be able to include on this trip that I probably can not do with a busload of students, partly because the bus can't get to all the locations. And this is sort of one of those areas. This is a statue of General John Reynolds, a Union general, and I'll talk about him in just a second, but it's a pretty good spot in that you can see a number of memorials and monuments and cannons that are set up here around Gettysburg. There are about 1,400 markers, equestrian statues, and about 400 cannons in Gettysburg National Park. And of those, as you can see here, General John Reynolds, there is, I guess, an old tradition in which horses, equestrian statues, if one hoof is raised on an equestrian statue, the person on that horse was injured in the battle. If two hooves are raised, that person was killed in battle. And if all four of the hooves of the horse are on the ground, that officer left the battle unscathed. And I know it's a little bit hard to see just because of my angle here. As I start to go out a little bit, I think you'll be able to see that Union General John Reynolds, a Lancaster native. If you guys remember the Lancaster field trip, his home was right in downtown Lancaster, and I said I would talk about him more another day. He was killed on day one of the battle, and you can see the two hooves of the horse, the equestrian statue, raised in the air, indicating that he in fact died in the battle. So as I said earlier, the town of Gettysburg was home of about 2,400 people, a Lutheran seminary, which is where I am now on Seminary Ridge, and you can see the statue back there of Martin Luther with a mask on, because it's of course 2021. You can see in a distance a college, that's Gettysburg College out in a distance. So the town was home to a seminary, about 2,400 residents, and a small college founded around the year 1830. And this is Seminary Ridge. And at the top of this building, as part of the seminary, you can see a cupola. And it would have been up there that General John Buford scouted out the lines for both the Confederate forces and the Union forces. And by the end of day one, which is where we are right now, on July 1st, 1863, he had the Union forces take that defensive position in and around town, holding the high ground at Culp's Hill and at Little Round Top. And I'll show you those in just a second, because that's where the action is going to be for day 2. You have markers like this one for A.P. Hill. What color shirts did A.P. Hill wear into battle? There's a question for you. Now, if we look off in a distance, we're going to be going out to where day 2 of the battle I'm going to focus in on, and some of the fiercest fighting, and that's going to be Little Round Top. So off to the left, you're going to have Culp's Hill, but we're going to zoom in over here to the right, and that's going to be Little Round Top and Big Round Top. So off to the right there, the big hill on the right, is Big Round Top. It stands about 100 feet taller than Little Round Top, but it had no strategic value, mostly because it was covered in woods and trees like it is now. But Little Round Top, and I know it's hard to see, but trust me, we'll get up there, is going to be of incredible strategic value because it's the high ground, and as you can see, it's completely open on one side. So this is where day 2, Lee is going to attempt to take the high grounds and the defensive positions that General Meade and the Union are now holding. So here I am at the top of Little Round Top, which is where some of the most intense fighting on day 2 occurred. We're on the high ground, and off in the distance is Culp's Hill, the other high ground that Robert E. Lee wanted taken. Obviously in battle, you always want the high ground as it gives you a strategic advantage. Big Round Top, which is 100 feet taller and there in a distance, is covered in trees, but Little Round Top was cleared of its trees the previous year by its owner, and did it for logging and to sell them for profit. So Little Round Top is open, and it was what Robert E. Lee wanted, and he tried it on July 2nd and again on July 3rd, both times failing. So put in charge here would have been General Warren. General Meade had put Warren in charge of holding Little Round Top, and he clearly understood its strategic importance, and he told General Dan Sickles to hold Little Round Top. Dan Sickles does the opposite. Dan Sickles, thinking that he can take the fight to its enemy, went down into the peach orchard down below and took the fighting there. And I'll talk more about Dan Sickles in class. Side of Little Round Top is going to be where a hero from Maine is going to save the Union, quite literally, and that is going to be Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, and we're going to walk over there in a few minutes. But off in a distance, you can see Devil's Den, which is an unusual feature of large boulders that you can see, large granite boulders off in a distance. It's about 500 yards away. Confederate sharpshooters would have hidden down in Devil's Den, firing at Union troops holding Little Round Top, and they were deadly accurate. With a scope and a sniper's rifle, they could hit a target with deadly accuracy at about 1,000 yards. That's about 10 football fields. And they're only about 500 yards away from here. So this would have been treacherous ground for the Union to hold. So behind me is the memorial for the 20th Regiment out of Maine, group of volunteers under the command of Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. And I'll be talking a lot more about Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain as we talk about the Civil War, because he'll be there obviously until the very end. He is a professor at Bowdoin College, great little liberal arts school up in Maine, still there today. He speaks 7 languages, and he asked to have to leave Bowdoin College for a sabbatical to fight in the Civil War, and the college denied that request. But it did allow him to go off and to study in Europe, but he didn't do that. He joined the war efforts, and it is here where General Gouverneur Warren understands the difficulty of holding Little Round Top and tells Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain in the 20th of Maine to hold this at all costs, meaning that they would have to give their lives if necessary to hold Little Round Top. So this is the backside of it. On the behind me is where the front is, where it's completely open to the valley beneath it, where we saw the statue of General Warren. Sickles went down to the peach orchard, and it is in this area behind me that the 15th Regiment of Alabama under Colonel John Oates throughout the afternoon on July 2nd is going to wave after wave try to take this land from Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. So coming up through the afternoon were the regiments of the Confederacy and Alabama until finally at 7 o'clock in the evening, running low on munitions, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain gives a textbook maneuver order for his men with fixed bayonets to charge down the hill, and overwhelmed the 15th Regiment out of Alabama, killing several hundred of them, taking others prisoner. Others just dropped their weapons and ran. And in the evening hours on July 2nd, 1863, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain saves the day here at Little Round Top. And had the Confederacy taken the high ground here, it's a what if in history, but there is a possibility that they would have won the Battle of Gettysburg. Perhaps the North would have had to push peace. It would have forced Lincoln's hand, and who knows how the war would have turned out. Of course, those are all what ifs in history. So down at the base here at Devil's Den, originally held by Union forces, but overwhelmed by Confederates by July 2nd, J.B. Hood, John Bell Hood's regiment, a Confederate, and his sharpshooters would hold this actually throughout the rest of the battle. And you can see these diabase rock formations at the base, and then at the top, off in a distance, you can see where I just was, and that would be Little Round Top up there. Behind me is the equestrian statue for General John Sedgwick. He was a Union general from Connecticut. He obviously was here at Gettysburg. He was not injured at Gettysburg, and you can see the equestrian statue has all 4 feet firmly planted on the ground. So he was not a casualty at Gettysburg, but he was killed in 1864 at the Battle of Spotsylvania, and his last words are sort of sadly famous. When being told to take cover because the Confederate troops were close and firing, he said they could not hit an elephant at this distance. That was it. So just to give you guys a little bit of an idea of what Gettysburg looks like today in the 21st century rather than in the mid-19th century, this is the downtown circle area, and a number of shops and restaurants and a hotel across the street there. Along the main thoroughfares. And then in the background here is the David Wills house. And David Wills invited Abraham Lincoln to spend the night at this house on November 18th and 19th, 1863, the night before he delivered his Gettysburg Address, and then the night after. And it was here on the second floor that he finalized that speech that he delivered at the National Cemetery. And look at that, look at that. We have ice cream nearby. I'm not going to that one. All right, mission accomplished. Yay. Most of the civilians in Gettysburg tried to get out of the town before the battle happened. About 170,000 troops collided in this tiny little sleepy, mostly farming village. African Americans in particular tried to get out of the town because it was not uncommon for African Americans to be re-enslaved by the Confederate Army, even if they were free and never slaves themselves. It happened near Sharpsburg, Maryland, before the Battle of Antietam, and they certainly weren't going to take their chance. The only civilian killed, this woman, Virginia Wade, who was killed on July 3rd, the last day of the battle, when she was trying to bake bread for Union troops. And you can see in her hand she's got a loaf of bread there. So Jenny Wade, the only civilian. John Burns, a resident of Gettysburg, veteran of the War of 1812. He was in his 70s, picked up a musket and went to fight for the Union. Became sort of a folk hero here in Gettysburg. So here we are along Seminary Ridge. This is where the Confederates had their cannons lined up, about 150 of them, aimed at Cemetery Ridge, which is about a mile away on the other side. By the afternoon of July 3rd, 1863, Robert E. Lee made the fateful decision to do a frontal assault on Cemetery Ridge, about a mile across here. It's going to be a little bit hard to see, but I'll zoom in on it. So there's a monument that you can see in a distance, and then behind it is the Pennsylvania Memorial back there as well. So that's where the Union lines were, along Cemetery Ridge, and we are on Seminary Ridge. And around 1:30 in the afternoon, about 150 cannons started to fire on Cemetery Ridge. They were missing. They were missing for a number of reasons. Nobody knows exactly why. Perhaps it was the heat of the day and about 2 hours of cannon fire that were being fired along this side, that the bores of the cannon got overly hot, allowing the fuses on the canisters that were being fired to explode a little bit, split second too late, over the troops along Cemetery Ridge. That's one. The other one is the recoil of the cannons after they were fired were sinking into the ground by as little as an inch would prevent them from hitting their targets, which they were deadly accurate with, artillerymen about a mile away. So that's a possibility, as they were sinking into the ground. And then the third one is that they were using new fuses coming out of the south, as their main supplier in Virginia had caught fire. So perhaps the canisters that were fused were exploding a little bit, again, just a split second or so late, over the Union troops. But they were not having much effect on the Union troops the 2 hours or so. So it was here where on July 3rd, the last day of the battle, that Robert E. Lee made the drastic and dire decision to send about 13,000 men across this open field. Their line stretched about a mile long as they were attacking Union positions on Cemetery Ridge about a mile away. He ordered Generals Pickett, Pettigrew, and Trimble and their men to cross the field trying to take the Union lines. General James Longstreet, a North Carolinian that I'll talk about in just a minute or two, tried to discourage the onslaught. He said they should take a more defensive position, which is what the Confederacy had done so brilliantly in almost every battle up until Gettysburg, and hold the ground there. Robert E. Lee said that was not going to be the case. He was either going to whip General Meade here or be whipped. And there is the statue of Robert E. Lee on his horse Traveler, his trusted horse. And the horse is actually buried with him at Washington and Lee College in Virginia. And I'll tell that story more when we're in class. So at 2:30 in the afternoon, the Union guns, the cannons on the other side there on Cemetery Ridge, fell silent. They were saving ammunition and trying to lull the Confederacy in. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, along Seminary Ridge, Robert E. Lee, who again is back there on Traveler that you can see in a distance, gave the order for 12,500 men being commanded by Generals Pickett, therefore it's known as Pickett's Charge, Trimble, and Pettigrew, to cross this field where I'm standing in the middle of right now, and to charge Union lines that are about a mile in the distance. There's the Pennsylvania Memorial. I'll drive over there in a few minutes and you'll get to see exactly where that is in comparison, in context to where I'm standing now near Robert E. Lee and Traveler. It is a bloodbath. The Union troops opened cannon fire and then musket fire and destroy Pickett's lines. The Confederacy makes it as far as, to show you how far it is, a copse of trees in a distance. That copse of trees there, and the angle, the high water mark, is also off in the distance, and I'll show you exactly where that is. When they returned, when they retreated off the field, Robert E. Lee meeting the Confederate forces on Traveler, saying, "It's my fault, it's all my fault," and eventually would retreat from Gettysburg after Pickett's charge. He offered his resignation to Jefferson Davis, who of course declined it. The first Confederate statue at Gettysburg was that of Robert E. Lee on his horse Traveler, put here in 1917 during that revisionist period of American history when they started glamorized the Confederacy during the lost cause of the South and its generals and soldiers. And he's up there on Traveler. Now, Robert E. Lee did lose his property during the Civil War. Montgomery Meigs, who was a major general of the Union, saw that Robert E. Lee owed $92.07 in taxes, back taxes, and as a result of that, had the federal government seize his property in Arlington, Virginia. Here's a question for you. What is his property used for today? So the most recent statue put here in Gettysburg is for that of General James Longstreet, who is here. The statue was put here in the late 1990s. And James Longstreet has a little bit of an unpopularity among Southerners, even to this day. First, he was from North Carolina, and for whatever reason, Southerners like to glamorize their Virginia generals. Secondly, here at Gettysburg, he questioned the tactics of Robert E. Lee, which was sacrilegious at the time. He wanted Robert E. Lee to take a more defensive position. He was against Pickett's charge. All he could possibly do was give the nod to General George Pickett to advance his men at 3 o'clock in the afternoon today, on July 3rd. He couldn't even bring himself to give the order. He wanted to take a defensive position, which is what the Confederacy was so good at up until this point. Finally, after the Civil War was over, he became a Republican in the South. From North Carolina, he was sympathetic to the process of reconstructing the South, the protection of African American rights, and the rebuilding of the United States with the readmission of Confederate states. And as a result of that, he was frowned upon back then, and even you could argue to today. So let's take a look at this statue. You'll notice that he almost appears as if he's riding a pony. The horse is 4/5 scale. It's small. It's too small for him. Secondly, it's not up on a pedestal. And finally, if you take a look at it, one hoof is raised, which gives you an indication that he was injured here at Gettysburg. He was not. He left completely unscathed. So, there is some question as to why this monument to him, this monument to James Longstreet, was done so irregularly. And the only thing I can surmise is, and it is true, it was done by a Virginian. So off in the distance here, you can see a farm. I know it's a little bit hard to see, and it's a bit of an aside from the actual battlefield of Gettysburg, but we're right here in Gettysburg, where a former president once resided after he was president. It was actually the only home this president ever had. And although he's more closely associated with a different state, this is actually his home that he owned. So what president lived here in Gettysburg? Okay, now that you know it was Dwight Eisenhower and his wife Mamie, let me ask you this. What state is more closely associated with Dwight Eisenhower? Certainly not Pennsylvania, although this is his house in Gettysburg. Where would you find his presidential library and museum? Abilene blank. What state? Here's Father William Corby, who on July 3rd, the final day, just shortly before Pickett's charge, gave absolution of sins to, he was a Catholic priest, but it didn't matter. Protestants lined up as well. It certainly couldn't hurt knowing what was going to be coming later that afternoon. Now, Father Corby is memorialized here at Gettysburg along Cemetery Ridge. We're on the Union lines now. But he's also, there's a statue for him at another location, a Catholic university, one of the most famous Catholic universities in America, where is the second monument to Reverend Father William Corby. So here we are at the Pennsylvania Memorial, which was completed in 1910 at the cost of $182,000. It requires 1,252 tons of granite. Lyon Cornell, who was an architect, received $500 for his winning design. Up at the top of it, it is crowned with the goddess of peace and victory. And she weighs 7,500. Let me zoom in here. 7,500 pounds. So the Pennsylvania Memorial, and then around the sides of it here are going to be names, 34,500 names for every Pennsylvanian who fought here at Gettysburg. And then at the top of it, you can see the major generals, Meade, who was the head of the Army of the Potomac, and then John Reynolds, who was killed. I showed you the statue of him earlier today. So we are standing along Cemetery Ridge, which is where the Union lines were dug in on that fateful day, July 3rd, 1863. And I'll show you off in a distance where the Confederates would have been coming from. So if you can look way out as I'm zooming in my iPhone here, you can see there is Robert E. Lee's statue, the Virginia Memorial, and this is that open field that nearly 13,000 men would have crossed that afternoon on July 3rd, totally to be mowed down by Union cannons and infantry. They made it as far as this wall. That corner right there is known as the angle. What they were aiming for was this copse of trees back over here. That copse of trees, which is still there obviously, and you can see the fence around it. So they made it, General Armistead and his mare made it as far as the angle here. This would essentially be the high water mark of the South. This is as far north as they ever would have gotten. General Armistead and the soldiers, including his horse that were able to cross over the Union lines, were immediately shot and killed. And from that point forward, the South is essentially going to retreat back, both figuratively and literally. Sort of literally here at Gettysburg, being pushed back off of this big expansive field, and figuratively in that this is the high water mark of the South. From this point forward, the area controlled by the Confederacy would be shrinking until the war finally was over, but it would not be over for quite some time yet. This is again just July 1863, would not be finished until April of 1865. So my last stop is going to be the Gettysburg National Cemetery. Here we are at the National Cemetery, where Abraham Lincoln delivered his famous speech, the Gettysburg Address, on November 18th, 1863, dedicating this as the first national cemetery in American history. And he was there to dedicate and commemorate those who lost their lives at this great battle during the Great Civil War. Over 7,000 people were killed in 3 days at Gettysburg, over 51,000 casualties. To this day, it is still the largest battle in the history of the Western Hemisphere. And Abraham Lincoln delivered his remarks, although he was not the keynote speaker. That would be Edward Everett of Massachusetts. Lincoln's speech was short, 272 words. But in that speech, which he delivered not far from that monument, he talked about who we are as Americans, what we were fighting for as Americans, and he gave us hope for the future of America. This concludes field trip number 7. Thank you for joining me on our excursion out to Gettysburg, and we'll work on finding a final fun location to do field trip number 8, virtual field trip number 8, a little bit later this year. Thanks.